I've got some more news for you on the Vince McMahon, Janel Grant front. And I wanted to cover it because it leads into two news items related to Vince this week that I feel need to be addressed here. Her sex trafficking lawsuit is still under stay while the feds investigate Vince, but that doesn't mean there hasn't been things going on. Among them is her petition against Dr. Carlin Kolker, Vince's celebrity doctor and his peak wellness clinic. She filed the petition back on July 16th, seeking her own medical records. After a judge dismissed McMahon's attempt to halt her motion, the doctor himself filed a motion last week against Janel Grant, alleging that her and her legal team were launching a smear campaign against him. Grant and her team filed a prompt response against him in the form of a motion on Monday to strike his complaint and dismiss his, quote, bill of discovery, while also seeking an award for statutory sanctions, costs, and attorney fees against the plaintiffs. They called his complaint a desperate and brazen attempt to silence a former patient investigating wrongdoing related to her medical care. Seems like he's going through a lot of trouble to fight this when it would be very easy for him if he wanted to release this woman's medical records to her. Unless he and his attorneys believe that that would not be in his best interest, which makes me wonder what's in those records that he's trying to hide. There's no word on when a ruling would be made there. Vince McMahon's lawyer, Jessica Taub, issued a statement to Wrestling Inc. that says, Ms. Grant first brought frivolous litigation to publicly harm Mr. McMahon's reputation. Then, despite agreeing to pause it at the government's request, she continued to publicly harass Mr. McMahon and those connected to him by initiating another frivolous action against Dr. Kolker and talking to the media about it. Mr. McMahon will continue to use every tool at his disposal to end this malicious and meritless pursuit by Ms. Grant. Where Vince ended up in the news again this week had nothing to do with the case itself, but with an unverified report from a podcast hosted by a man by the name of Lee Cole. Now, for those who don't know, Lee Cole is the older brother of Tom Cole, who was the ring boy at the center of the WWF ring boy scandal in the 80s and the early 90s. Tom was recruited by Mel Phillips to be part of the WWF ring crew. Mel Phillips was a ring announcer for them for many years. He had a thing for little boys, mainly their feet. He was a sicko, and I don't mean in the way that Tony Khan has his AEW sicko fans that he talks about. This guy was a real sicko. That didn't stop Vince McMahon from rehiring him years later. Vince actually said publicly after he fired Mel Phillips that he found his relationship with children peculiar. But then later he rehired him on the condition that he stay away from kids. Imagine you run a company and you come to learn that one of your employees is a child predator. So you get rid of him. But then 5 years later you decide, you know what? Let's bring that guy back. Just make sure you don't bring your kid to work while he's around. Anyway, Tom Cole committed suicide a few years ago after dealing with some extreme depression, which was said to be brought on in part by the way in which Pat Patterson was talked about so glowingly in the wake of his passing. Patterson had only died 2 months earlier than that, before Cole committed suicide. And he never claimed, all those years ago, he never claimed that Patterson did anything to him sexually, but he felt that he knew everything that Terry Garvin and Mel Phillips had been doing at the time, and he did nothing to stop it. So it bothered him to see all of this praise for a man that he felt didn't deserve it, and that may have contributed to the depression that he was suffering from at the time that ultimately resulted in him taking his own life. His brother Lee now hosts a podcast called Wrestling with the Devil. And on that podcast this week, which you can find on YouTube, he claimed that Linda McMahon has been telling people close to her that her husband's health has been rapidly declining. His health is getting progressively worse. Now, if you search around, there is no evidence of any comments that Linda has made publicly about Vince's health. In fact, the last time she was on video even addressing her family at all was last month, and she said everything was great. So I can find no mentions of her saying anything like that publicly. But he claims that she's saying it privately. So I was skeptical to begin with, given that he's the only person saying this, and he obviously has no love lost for Vince McMahon, which is understandable. Now, Vince turned 79 years old this Saturday, and the last few times that I've seen him, he was still walking around with a cane, but he had major spinal surgery many months ago. So for a 79-year-old or almost 79-year-old man who underwent a major spinal operation, it's not surprising that he would be walking around with a cane. I'm more disturbed about his melting face, but that's neither here nor there. Vince's lawyer said in a statement in regards to this rumor going around this week, we have no idea where the rumor that he had health issues came from, but it is not true. So that ends that. I don't think that there's anything to it. That didn't stop a bunch of people from running with it, though, like it was legitimate vetted news. Now, on the Vince stuff, there have been wrestlers that have been asked publicly since he left WWE and the lawsuit was filed and the allegations came out. They've been asked to comment on the allegations against him. And I can understand, it puts them in a difficult spot because some of them were very close with him. Some of them still are. John Cena is. John Cena said he still loves the man. He said, when you love someone, you love them as imperfect as they are. Which is a hell of a thing to say about somebody accused of rape and sex trafficking. With so many non-disclosure agreements signed, I can't even keep track. Randy Orton said that he still loves Vince, but he read the accusations and it hurts his heart. Seth Rollins called it a disgusting situation. Bret Hart said that he still had some respect for Vince, but knowing what kind of weirdo he became, he has absolutely zero respect for him. You could always rely on Bret to tell it like it is. Kevin Nash said that if he did what he's alleged to have done to this woman, then she should want to see him rot away in prison and not accept money from him. Before then saying that her attorney is short and blonde and looks like she got her law degree from some online college. Mind you, this woman used to be a judge. Okay, the attorney representing Janel Grant, she was a judge at one time. I think when Kevin Nash tore his quad, he also tore a hole in his fucking brain. And then there's Mark Henry. Mark Henry appeared on an episode of Bradshaw and Gerald Briscoe's Briscoe and Bradshaw podcast. It was a 2-hour show. At around the hour 50 mark, he commented on the Vince McMahon Janel Grant stuff. Now, I watched that part of the interview for myself. They were talking about working for Vince, and Mark brought up that Vince is going through a tough time right now. Like he's battling cancer or something. The tough time he's referring to is being accused of rape and sex trafficking, just so we're all clear. Even John Laurinaitis, through his attorney, at one point threw Vince under the bus and played the victim card himself, which only gave credibility to the fact that at least some of this stuff has merit to it. Probably more than some, but to be fair right now, these are just allegations. But the man is going through a tough time, you see. He's going through a rough patch in his life. Mark said that he never saw any of that type of stuff that Vince has been accused of. He never heard no negativity like that. He said that negativity came about when one of the victims stopped getting paid. And he complained that people were calling him insensitive for saying these things before and how there's other people that suffer too. To which he said, yeah, but some of those people, their suffering got worse when the money ran out. A word of advice for everyone listening to this. When you are digging a hole for yourself, and that hole is so deep, you can see the earth's core, you're supposed to stop digging. But he kept going. He said, where was the suffering when they were getting BMWs and $1 million? Did that pacify their suffering? Because if you're suffering, you should suffer all the time, right? Nothing should get in the way of that. I don't know. I just come from a different time. Apparently that was Jurassic times, when the dinosaurs still roamed free. I like Mark. I had the chance to sit down and interview him in Philadelphia this year, WrestleMania week. He's a smart guy. So it bothers me when I hear a reasonably intelligent person say something so tone-deaf and stupid. If we are to assume that even some of what Janel Grant alleges in her lawsuit is true and actually happened over a long period of time, there was a lot of manipulation going on there. You hear that criticism a lot in stories about people in abusive relationships, usually women in abusive relationships. Why do they stay? If they're being abused or they're so unhappy, why don't they just leave? Why don't they just pick up the phone and call the cops, right? That's a very simplistic way of looking at it. The circumstances are different in every case. I don't claim to be an expert on all of them, but I can understand the psychology behind it. Sometimes it's out of fear or intimidation, or maybe they do sometimes feel they're getting something out of it, and they're willing to tolerate it. Even if you believe that to be true, let's take the most cynical point of view on this, that it was all about the money and the gifts. And when it all ran dry, then she filed suit. Do you not see the problem here? None of that excuses this type of behavior from anyone, let alone someone in a position of power like Vince McMahon, who abuses that power. And I think it's far worse than that, because I can absolutely believe the things claimed in that lawsuit. But even if you strip away all of the salacious details, when your first thought is, yeah, well, it couldn't have been that bad if she stayed quiet until the money ran out. Like, if your first thought is to leap to the man's defense and victim blame in this case, especially given what we're talking about here, I mean, we're not talking about a friend who's been accused of stealing money out of petty cash to pay off his fucking bookie. If that's your first instinct, then I think that says more about you than anything else. Especially when in the very next breath, he tells a story about how kind Vince was to the legends that they would bring to TV, how he wanted to get as many of them a payday as he possibly could. I mean, he put $1,500 in Baron von Raschke's pocket, for crying out loud. Well, by God, give that man the Humanitarian of the fucking Year award. It was just very disappointing to hear him say what he said. I'm not necessarily surprised. There is this bizarre sort of blind loyalty that a lot of these guys have for that man because he made them a lot of money. Maybe that explains why they focus so heavily on the money aspect of all this. Because they themselves are so hung up on the money they made with Vince and how much he changed their lives. Kevin Nash used to say it all the time. He learned it from Lou Albano. The only two things that matter in this business are the money and the miles. Who knew that Captain Lou was a damn prophet?